The universe of Soma portrays a gripping tale of humanity's quest for self-preservation, from the development of artificial intelligence to creating new forms of existence in the shadow of total annihilation. This video will delve into the events that took place in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean within Pathos II, examining the context to these stories and showing how an AI that was originally designed to assist humanity imposed preservation onto these people, regardless if they wanted it or not, with the AI stripping their ability to deny or accept the form of treatment it gave onto them. Welcome to the complete history, lore, and timeline of Soma. In July 1988, Simon Jarrett had been born in Canada, where he lived with his mother, Marie Jarrett. Not much is known about Simon's childhood or his family. However, what we do know is that once his adult life had begun, he had worked at a bookstore in Toronto, Canada, alongside his two friends, Ashley and Jesse. Simon led a simple and quiet life, where he lived alone in his apartment building, where he would play video games and watch television, often possessing an easygoing attitude, appearing as relaxed and wouldn't be easily stressed out. But even if he was, it wouldn't be too much of an issue for him. However, this appetite for enjoying life would soon be threatened on the 9th of April 2015. When he, Ashley, and one of his colleagues had been driving towards an intersection when, out of nowhere, an SUV had struck their vehicle, causing them to crash due to the driver becoming distracted by her children. While the family had escaped the crash with only minor injuries, such as grazes and bruising, the same could not be said for Ashley, as she shortly died on scene due to her lungs filling with her own blood. Simon, on the other hand, had survived, receiving a blow to his head with blood trailing down. Once the paramedics had arrived, they had transported him to the St. Mary Hospital, where Simon was placed under the care of Dr. Erin Peake, and he was soon diagnosed with an injury to his brain, where it was discovered that Simon's brain would swell due to certain volumes of stress, which would cause him headaches and nosebleeds, and if the stress was too much for him, he would eventually pass out as a result of it, which would put a cap on his life expectancy, where it had been measured in a matter of months if he did not receive treatment soon. This had devastated Simon to no end, where he began to live his life more cautiously, rarely engaging in activities that once brought him joy, just in case it caused him to flare up in stress, avoiding things like television or games. His apartment had become cluttered, his diet now consisting of frozen meals and fast food. It was as though his life had been put on hold for the time being. That was until he had been contacted by Dr. Munshi, a neuroscientist who had been working on neurography, a technology that had once been described to copy a subject's consciousness, personality, and memories, transmuting them into a data format. Munshi, with the help of his colleague Paul Berg, had taken the design and had been attempting to use the technology for the field of medicine, so that the optimal treatment could be found for a patient sooner than expected. If this worked, then this would be an invaluable tool across the world, allowing doctors to save time in the pursuit of helping people with terrible illnesses, afflictions, and diseases. Simon, upon hearing this news, saw this as an opportunity to turn what could be months of living into possible decades of experiences, and so he accepted the proposition they gave to him. Once he had arrived at the Pace facility, he saw how it had been empty, as if the property wasn't quite open for business just yet. He was soon approached by Dr. Munshi, who was pleased to see him, to possibly help him with his current plight. Munshi's goal was to run the device on a damaged brain, to produce a computer model where they could run tests on the data without causing risks or discomfort to the patient, which would be very appealing in the eyes of the public. However, this wasn't the first time the two had operated the brain scan. In fact, they had given themselves to their work before, operating the brain scans on their own minds before testing it on Simon. As a result of the brain scan and some tests, Simon had been placed on a treatment plan which involved daily exercises and some dietary momentary changes. With this in hand, Simon thought that maybe his troubles would be over, that this would be the stepping stone to uncovering the next chapter in his life. But just as that appetite for enjoying life had been brought into perspective, the symptoms had gotten worse, causing his brain to deteriorate even more so than before over the course of a single month, and Simon's body had given way, leading him to his deathbed. However, Simon had suggested that just because his brain scan didn't save him, that maybe Dr. Munshi could help others with it, which the good doctor had intended to do just that, where he kept the brain scan with that prospect in mind, and at the age of 26, Simon Jarrett had tragically passed away. In the years passing his death, the research and development of neurograph technology had fallen into a great decline, but with endings comes new beginnings, as those within the field of robotics had seen great value in Dr. Munshi's work, where he allowed those who approached him to use Simon's neurograph in the development of artificial intelligence technology, and over the years, the two doctors had assisted the robotics research as AI had been implemented into technology throughout the world, where the technology had become so advanced that it was even possible to begin communicating with the data stream, where the scans had become aware of their memories, leading up to the point they were scanned, but were unaware of the fact that they were just a copy of the original, which Munshi at the age of 90 had been interviewed about the technology, where they asked about his deceased wife and colleague Dr. Berg, asking if he would consider bringing them back with this technology, but he told them that he wouldn't, even though it would bring him joy to talk to them again, but that they wouldn't be themselves, not really, that they weren't human, and he believed if the copies were to discover what they were, then they would become unstable and go mad, a sight Munshi would not want to see. Moving through time, we come to the 2060s, where a multinational research organization had been established across several locations, with these being Lisbon, Portugal, London, Cadiz, and New York, where the organization had been funded by two corporations through investments, with these companies being Carthage Industries and Hamatsu Technologies. This added funding gave the organization the ability to begin construction of a new thermal mining station located in the depths of the North Atlantic Ocean, which would be the precursor for Pathos II, and over the years, engineers and other workers had expanded their horizons, building new sites and stations, allowing for more developments to come within researching the aspects of aquatic life and other such things. With the sites being isolated from the world outside, the facility had consisted of 9 sites, which began with the topside station Omega, that was used to house the tip of the Omega space gun and to monitor weather patterns. The plateau had been the more shallow section of Pathos II, with this area consisting of sites Upsilon, Delta, Lambda, Theta, and Omicron. Site Upsilon had primarily been used to generate electricity with the use of geothermal boreholes, but it also housed a repair station to service the robot helpers that were used to assist the personnel. Site Delta had been used to build the aerodynamic shells for the Omega space gun for payloads to be placed in, where it had been situated on an outcrop that extended out of the abyss, which had been the deepest and darkest location of the facility. Site Theta had been the main hub for the facility and was one of the largest in Pathos II, where it housed many living quarters for the personnel and other employees, laboratories, and offices for administration. Site Lambda may have been the welcoming center for potential visitors and new workers, with it housing a transport hub used to connect the sites within the plateau together, and Site Omicron had been located on the edge of the plateau that overlooked the abyss, which had been used to study and research marine biology, hydroponics, and the effects of structure gel, where the site had also housed the Abyss Climber Rig, which had been an elevator that was used to transport people from this site down to the other sites within the abyss. Delving deeper into the darkness brings us to the Omega Sector that contained the last 3 sites, with these being Tau, Alpha, and Phi, with Site Tau being used to transport the payloads to the Omega space gun, with its use of its transit system that would connect to Site Phi. This site also contained living quarters as well. Site Phi's purpose had been to house the massive Omega space gun that would be used to fire projectiles out into the deep recesses of space, where it could fire a payload of 10 tons at the speed of 42 kilometers per hour, where the barrel had reached all the way to the surface, connecting the Phi and Omega sites together. The last site, Alpha, had been built in secret, which would eventually house the heart of the WoW. In the meantime, the organization had implemented a new policy where all employees of Pathos II needed to be injected with a device known as the Black Box, which would be used to keep the employees safe, and allowed others to monitor their biometric data so that their vitals could be monitored. Above Pathos II, however, a new crisis had been developing once a large interstellar object had been discovered coming towards the solar system at great speeds. Upon further examination of its trajectory, scientists had confirmed that it was locked on a collision course with the Earth, and due to its great size, a collision could mean the end to all life on the planet, or at the very least, all land-dwelling life. Since the size was said to be in between 11 and 81 kilometers in diameter, being far larger than the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. Once a shocking discovery had been made, a global body had been established as the International Asteroid Deflection Program, who had been tasked with the mission to safeguard the Earth. One person in particular who had worked within this program had been Catherine Chun, but she would later down the line begin working within Pathos II. Fortunately, the theorized amount of time humanity had remaining had been around 10 years, so they had time to prepare for the devastation that was to come to pass. In the time remaining, the asteroid deflection program had made good use of the Omega space gun, with them sending satellite bombardment platforms into space in the hopes to veer the comet off course. As time went on, Carthage Industries had been developing a new AI to help maintain and run Pathos II's systems more smoothly, with a directive to help preserve human life, where the AI had been biologically engineered, with its appearance being a sphere made of white organic matter. The impending devastation coming to pass as a potential reality may have been the reason the WoW had been developed. However, this isn't confirmed to be the motivation behind its creation so far. However, the WoW was soon taken down into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, where it was up to Carthage's employees, Mark Sarang, Johan Ross, and Julia Dow, to oversee its installation into Alpha Site, where they soon implemented it into a station-wide presence. And once the news had gotten back to Carthage, the supervisory board had sent over more instructions to Mark in a letter, informing him that it would be down to Ross to steer the WoW, and to contact Julia should it become necessary to forcefully eliminate any opposition. Ross had then begun to inject and pump structure gel into the white sphere of the WoW, so it could change its biological code. Heather would later be convinced by Ross that they should make the WoW their caretaker by default. Despite the efforts made by the International Asteroid Deflection Program, the comet had still been locked on course. It seemed that the object had been too large to be simply deflected from its collision course. Some people began to make their own preparations, where they thought that they could withstand the impact inside mountains where they had constructed bomb shelters. Others had accepted their fate, waiting for the inevitable with their families and loved ones. Companies and corporations, however, chose to spend their time backing up their assets. In one-ditch effort, humanity tried one more attempt to veer the comet off course with the use of rocketry, but it seemed that their fate was already set in stone. In the countdown to total destruction, Chris's father had emailed him for the last time. Chris, I've stayed up all night. Seemed like a waste to sleep. I got the TV on in the background. The newscasters are covering the incoming comet, like they were counting down for New Year's Eve. I know it's messed up wishing you were here with me. I suppose if anyone has the chance to survive this thing, it would be you guys below the waves. I hope you are able to go on, if it's a life worth living. Looks like this shit's about to hit the fan. I better hit send before the shockwave reaches us. I'm proud of you, boy. Dad. On the 10th of January 2103, at 7:24 p.m., the officers of the multinational organization had made their contacts to Site Upsilon in Pathos II, where these contacts issue out from the other locations until 4:52 a.m. The end was near, with the comet piercing the atmosphere and plunging towards the Pacific Ocean, and at 5:12 a.m., the last contact from Cadiz had been made to Upsilon, and with it, the extermination of all land-dwelling life. Upon impact, the comet had created a massive explosion that propelled dust and debris throughout the atmosphere, triggering firestorms that consumed the land and cities. The impact caused tsunamis to occur, with tidal waves sweeping coastal towns and cities off the map. The atmosphere became a lot hotter than normal, with thunderstorms brewing. The atmosphere became increasingly toxic, poisoning the air. During the chaos, a ship known as the MS Curie had witnessed the terrifying ordeal, with the flames scorching the lands, reaching outwards towards the skies that were poisoned by smoke and debris.
The sky is pitch black with smoke. The ocean is dark. Incredibly dark. In the distance, I can see land. According to navigation, it's Lisbon, the coast of Portugal. Any signs of life? Over. It's on fire. Everything is on fire. The flames, they're reaching all the way into the sky. It's unreal. Any signs of life? Over. No. Nothing but a massive firestorm covering the continent. For the rest of the world, there's no good way to describe it. The destruction is absolute. The surface is just gone.
Eventually, with hope fading, the Curie attempted to travel back to Pathos II, but after a lengthy journey, the crew had begun to suffocate due to the lack of oxygen, just short of Lambda. Even though the lands of Earth had been completely destroyed in the wake of the impact, the oceans were a different story, with many aquatic life remaining, and Pathos II remained fairly untouched. The 12th of January 2103 had marked the fall of humanity, with the only survivors of the comet, Telos, being located in Pathos II. In the following days, the WoW had begun to go through some changes, dropping down to a low energy state, but still maintaining the systems while conserving its full abilities, as it began to revert to one of its primary directives: to preserve humanity as best as it can, with whatever resources it had at its disposal. Nearly a week later, a wrangler, Carl Semkin, had been repairing a pilot's seat where the WoW had taken a brain scan of him, which made him feel unwell after the procedure. Upon investigation, the pilot's seat diagnostics had shown a spike in electromagnetism surrounding the helmet of the seat, but they couldn't pinpoint what caused this issue to occur. But soon after this, another worker, Gavin, had been attacked by a robot helper, where it had knocked him unconscious in the struggle. It is due to these incidents that Chief Factor Jane Addams warned against using the pilot systems. Moving into March, Lisa Cameron, an operative for Pathos II, had discovered that the structure gel had been going through some changes, that it will continue to hold an electric charge after being disconnected from a power source, where she began to theorize that maybe they could use this gel to help with connectivity within circuitry. And when conducting an experiment with simple machinery, she saw that the gel had been making it work more efficiently, but that the modifications the WoW had applied to the structure gel had been full of extra information that didn't make sense to her at this time. But when this gel had been applied to something more complicated, it would act as a cancer on the selected host, and eventually ruin the host. She thought to herself, however, that the jail could still be used for their benefit, but it would first need to be recalibrated to get rid of the bad code. It was due to these issues that people had grown concerned in Site Upsilon, and so an order had been sent out to evacuate the site until these concerns had been properly addressed, and the people who were stationed there would be relocated to Site Theta. Near the end of the following month in April, the Theta dispatcher Peter Strasky had called up the Upsilon dispatcher to ask for updates on the evacuation, where they told him that there was still more to do, but that Carl Simpkin and field service technician Amy will be staying at Upsilon to automate the power supply. But on the following day, John C. had called Peter to inform him that the Upsilon team would be leaving the site soon. Soon after this transmission, Carl had called Peter and asked if he could get a direct communication with Heather, but he had declined due to issues with communication, that it was nearly impossible to have direct links to people these days. But he told Carl that he can take messages for Heather in the comm center, but Carl had hung up without leaving a message behind. On the 3rd of May, Amy had wrote a letter to Heather with her concerns about machines interfering with the power systems after they shut the site down, which Heather responded with a suggestion that she and Carl use pneumatic seals to seal off the sectors as they leave to help with containment. And on the following day, Carl had told Peter that he and Amy were about to seal the comm center off, and then they would be heading for a shuttle, and would meet them in a few hours at Site Theta. But this sadly would not come to pass, as a Mockingbird robot had killed Carl, where Amy could do nothing but run from the horror in pure shock of what had just transpired before her eyes.
Did you get the final backup turbos going?
Everything is wired evenly. We've hedged our bets as much as we possibly can.
So that's it? Enough power to run Pathos II until the next apocalypse. We're ready to go.
I really hope we didn't mess anything up. I don't want to have to come back here again.
Relax, it's over. We're going Theta.
Maybe we should seal more blocks. I don't trust the helpers to let this place run in peace.
We've sealed everything. Everything from the barracks to the comm center. If anyone ever sets their foot here again, they're gonna have a hell of a time getting around.
Carl!
But as she attempts to restore some power to the shuttle so she can make her escape, she had become severely injured, to the point she couldn't breathe on her own. But due to the leaking of the pipes that contained structure gel, it had dripped onto her, creating an artificial lung, forcing her to stay alive, even if she didn't want to live trapped in one location for the rest of her days. It seemed that the WoW had taken its directive very seriously, to preserve humanity by any means necessary. At some point, Site Lambda had also been evacuated to join the residents of Site Theta. On the 7th of May, Jacob Halperin at Site Omicron had been experimenting with the structure gel and its behaviors with deceased organisms, where he used dead mice in his studies, where he had witnessed the gel encompassing the dead mouse, entering the cracks in its skin, and reanimating the mouse from within. From this, Jacob had grown curious, so he had placed the mouse into a habitat with an alive and healthy mouse, which became very stressed in the reanimated mouse's presence. The reanimated mouse had pounced on the live one before savagely killing it, but after half an hour, the structure gel had hardened and the reanimated mouse had stopped in its tracks. A month later, on the 6th of June, Imogen Reed at Site Theta had investigated a machine that had been corrupted by the WoW, where Catherine would later remark that it almost looked to be a trap to lure in the scientists. The machine had created a reality around Imogen artificially. Catherine noted that it seemed to imitate her own reality capsule, which would be later known as the Ark. Upon dissecting the machine, Catherine had found that it contained perfect copies of brain scans, which wasn't like her own prototype, since her device could only make model neurographs, or, as she called, flat people. This is where she declares her newfound goal to save humanity by building the Ark, to contain copies of the Pathos II personnel, even though at first she didn't fully understand how the scanning process worked, but nonetheless, she began preparations to try and replicate the WoW's technique, where she had assembled her team who were enthusiastic about the project, since it would give them all a sense of purpose once again. The team had consisted of Jasper Hill, Ian Peterson, Nikolai, and Sarah Lindwall. After Catherine had conducted the first scans on herself and her team, she had seen that these were successful, and she theorized that the WoW had been stealing brain scans from pilot seats. To what end though, she couldn't say just yet. But this didn't concern her. Rather, she pitched a plan to other members of Pathos II, and the project had been given the green light to begin the ARC project. Back in Omicron, Jacob had continued with his experiments, where this time he had used uncalibrated gel, where he had grown impressed with the results. That instead of aggression, he found that the mouse had been catatonic, almost like a sleepwalker. He also made use of electromagnets to push through a low electrical current into the animal to prevent the gel from hardening, which he believed that he could control the gel using this technique. A month later, however, an incident had occurred with Mark Sarang, who tragically took his own life after receiving a scan from Catherine. He did this because he believed that he would become his copy on the Ark, which isn't how that works, and this death had caused the project to be put on hold for the time being. But as it came up to August, Catherine resumed the project with her scanning more of the personnel, which followed with more deaths. On the 12th of August, Supervisor Dorian had emailed Terry Akers at Site Delta that he and the rest of the team have decided to leave the site in the next 2 days, evacuating to Site Theta due to growing concerns about the WoW and the deterioration of Delta, where he told Terry that he wouldn't be continuing his reign of leadership, which angered him greatly and gave him only resentment, which Terry had replied with an angry letter, which Dorian responded by saying that his stance wouldn't change their decision. At the same time, Catherine's scans had claimed another victim, as Gavin Finley also took their life after the scan. As the Delta team had arrived in Theta, Peter Stratsky had informed Terry that his former crew had safely arrived in Theta, but offered him a spot in the site when he feels ready to join, and all he needed to do was merely tell him when the time was right. But as August had come to a close, 2 more members had ended their lives, which forced security operative John Strohmeyer to intervene, where he told Catherine if 1 more had died, then the ARC project would be over. But this didn't stop Catherine, as she was content with continuing the project in her pursuit of saving humanity. But on the 2nd of September, Guy Conrad had also ended his life in the pilot seat after being scanned, where he used a microwave emitter on his own head, which Catherine knew if this was to be discovered, then it would be all for nothing. Her attempts to save humanity would be over, so she turned to Peter Stratsky for help in covering up the death. But Peter had no choice but to inform John of the unfortunate news, where a funeral had soon been held for those who had tragically ended their lives, and the ARC project had been terminated indefinitely. Since Site Lambda had been evacuated and was now empty, a salvage team had been sent in to investigate further. This team had consisted of Imogen Reed, Adam Goloski, Vanessa Hart, Baxter Rogers, Richard Holland, Jessica Davis, Martin Fisher, and Dorian, where they began to set up their operations there. With the growing influence of the WoW and the strange occurrences continuing, Site Tau had started their own evacuation, and Julia had been asked to assist the personnel with the use of the climber rig. However, once she had arrived in the darkness, she used the guide lights so she could find her way to the site, keeping her radio on so she could find the personnel in the gloom. But after some time, the guide lights had begun to flicker and had suddenly disappeared from view. But fortunately, Julia had packed a floodlight, which she had used to help her in her task. But after a few moments, she had found a field worker Espinosa, where his body had been nearly cut in two. Suddenly, Julia heard screams over the radio in inaudible language that sounded like the crew was under attack from something. This had frightened Julia to the point where she had gone back to the climber rig and reported that the evacuation had been a complete failure, which led others to believing that the personnel of Site Tau were all dead, so there would be no need to send any supplies out to them. Back inside Site Lambda, the salvage crew had encountered a lot of structure gel along with robots who believed that they had been human, where Imogen and Adam had spoken to one of these robots, who told them that they had been a man known as Harry, one of Adam's friends, which had confused the pair just as much as the robot had been, so they had shut him down and continued with their present task. In other areas of Pathos II, the WoW had been busy creating new Mockingbird robots that would be highly aggressive towards others, and those who had been unfortunate enough to be attacked by them would either be killed by these monstrosities or would be infused with the structure gel, with artificial organs growing on them to help preserve their lives. But others had found themselves changing when they became infected with large amounts of the structure gel, creating nightmarish creatures that patrolled the abandoned halls of these sites. These would be later known as proxies and flesher creatures. Even though the WoW intended to keep these creatures alive, they were in a constant state of misery and agony, leading into madness and insanity. On the 1st of November, John had asked Dr. Masters to give Catherine a full psychiatric evaluation, where the results found Catherine to be weak in her overall character, the perfect victim to be domineered and pushed around by others. 18 days later, A. Coetzee had left Site Tau in search for any scraps of food she could find, but she would find none and returned to the site empty-handed, since the report Julia had filed had convinced people that they were actually dead, so the survivors of Tau were on their own and forced to endure their own starvation, where Ross believed that Coetzee had been leaving the site, hoping to meet her end rather than being forced to take it herself. On the 12th of December at Site Omicron, Paula Lansky had continued studying the structure gel, where she noted that it had remained unchanged on a fundamental level, that it wasn't quite the gel that was an issue, but rather the one who had control over it, that the gel hadn't gained new properties, but the WoW was using it in ways that they hadn't thought of before. Dr. Claudia Eames had concluded that all the deformed creatures they had seen had been manipulated by the WoW through the structure gel. Back in Lambda, the situation had turned into chaos with the death of Jessica and hyperaggression of Adam, with the team being picked off one by one, where Imogen and Vanessa were the only team members to survive this ordeal, and despite her protests, Imogen had gone to Site Upsilon, and Vanessa began the long trek back to Site Theta, and once she had arrived, she was attended to by Dr. Masters, who saw she had mild injuries such as bruising and suffered from mild hypothermia. On the 25th of December, Peter Strasky had written a Merry Christmas email to Terry Ackers, where again he offered him transport to Theta, and after this, Catherine had assembled her team to take the Ark down to the Omega Space Gun into the abyss below. Once the team had descended into the shadowy abyss, they had attempted to contact Tau, but they had no luck. But eventually they did establish contact with them, telling them to open the doors for them. But once they had arrived, the truth had dawned on them that there had been only a few survivors remaining, where they were sick and out of food. And thanks to Julia's report, no one knew of their presence at Tau. While they had stayed at Tau, the survivors had agreed to take part in brain scans, even though Ross had believed the idea of the Ark to be a silly but endearing one. The Ark team had told the survivors of the climber rig returning to pick them up the following day. Eventually, the Ark team had made their way to Site Phi and had reached the shell in which they would place the Ark inside and seal it up before firing the massive Omega space gun. However, the group had their disagreements with what they should do, as there was a concern that the process of firing the Ark could destroy it, making all of their work up to this point meaningless. But Catherine had her heart set on this, being the only outcome, that they must fire the Ark outward into into space, which the disagreement soon turned violent when Ian had picked up a tool and hit Catherine, killing her with a blow to her head. But once it had dawned on him what he had just done, he told the others that it was an accident, that he didn't mean to kill her. The ARC team had then left Site Phi to traverse back to Site Tau, as per Ross's log, where he wrote that the team had postponed the launch of the ARC and that they were all in a foul mood, and were difficult to get any direct answers out of them. The only thing Ross could get out of them had been that they had wished to remain at Tau to figure out what they should do with the ARC, which Ross had taken this as an opportunity to leave the site and get into the climber rig so he can warn others of what has happened with the WoW, which he and Glasser had traversed the depths, but on the way Glasser had been killed by the wildlife, and Ross manages to find the climber while being badly injured, but according to Julia's report, he had succumbed to his wounds and perished while riding the climber, where his body had been retrieved and taken to Site Omicron, where Lisa Cameron, Dr. Eames, and Paul Lansky had studied his body inside containment. She also documents that the WoW had been making a big buzz about Ross's death, where it had been overloading systems which included the black boxes, which gave the staff headaches, disrupting their sleep patterns and gave them increased levels of stress. Crew members had been bleeding from their noses and eyes, which had been the side effects of the WoW, exerting control over electromagnetic fields in an attempt to heal and resuscitate Dr. Ross through the structure gel inside his body. Moving into the new year, the Theta staff list had been updated, including a list of guests, with those being survivors from other outlying sites, with updates to the list of the dead as well. Later into January 2104, a leak had occurred, allowing some of the structure gel to fester within the Dunbat robot, which had allowed the WoW to assume control over it, where the personnel had managed to quarantine the robot, with someone remarking that the last thing they needed was a talking robot. On the 15th of January, a Kurz had called Theta, requesting transport to the site as he was now ready to join the other survivors, which Peter had soon dispatched divers who were already surveying Lambda to pick him up. However, once they had arrived, they had been ambushed by Terry, who proceeded to inject them all with structure gel, and had escaped using the Zeppelin they had used. Evans, however, would soon die since he removed what was attached to him, presumably the structure gel that had hardened into a growth, where he had bled out onto the floor, which left Maggie to warn the Theta site before it is too late. But she had soon died while attempting to contact Strasky. Kurz had then used a Zeppelin to travel towards the Theta site, where his appearance had been grotesque, with his eyes missing due to him removing them previously. While this had been happening, Lisa Cameron had written in her log that the WoW had been repairing Ross's corpse, which she also theorized that the radiation seemed to play a role in instructing the gel within his body. The next day, on the 16th of January 2104, Terry had arrived at the Theta site in the early hours of the morning, where he had fallen unconscious, where Emma had called Strasky, telling him to wake up Dr. Masters because they had been bringing in Terry. Through their tests, they could see that Terry had been consuming the structure gel, which led to malnourishment. They could also see mutations happening inside him at the cellular level. They note, due to the gel festering inside him, and because of these mutations, he is unlikely to wake up. But then Terry had seemingly rose from the dead before savagely bashing Dr. Masters' skull in before she could finish her medical report, leaving her slumped in her chair. Rayleigh at this time had called Strasky, telling him that she has to go and do something important and wouldn't be around for the next couple of days, as Ross had influenced her psychically to take the uncalibrated structure gel down into the Alpha site and to destroy the WoW within it. Rayleigh had then began the journey down to Alpha site to complete this task, which she had asked Julia about the location of Alpha, which she later remarked as asking questions she shouldn't be, but that she couldn't bring herself to stop her. But once she had arrived at Site Alpha, the WoW had let out a shriek that overloaded her black box, causing Rayleigh to die inside her power suit, which this frequency had traveled across to Omicron as well, which caused everyone there to die, and Julia's head had exploded as she was writing up her log. Back inside Theta, Terry had been on a vicious rampage where he had been joined by several proxies, where John had managed to put a couple of them down before having to flee, where Brandon 1 had told John and Alice over the comms that he was going to cause a diversion so that others can escape. The battle against Terry's new form was a terrifying one, where Terry had unparalleled strength, able to smash through heavy doors and barriers, and he was merciless in his pursuit of his prey, able to outrun those who fled. However, Brandon had trapped himself inside the laboratory level with Terry so others could escape the onslaught, allowing the survivors of this brutal attack to flee down into the basement. Strasky, John C., Vanessa, Emma, and Richard had all managed to escape Theta, where they headed for Omicron. However, Vanessa had been badly injured after she had blown up the oxygen surplus which had sealed the tunnels, so Terry could not pursue them any further. At Omicron, the site had been under a quarantine, and the comms had been unresponsive, which Strasky, Emma, and Richard had decided to head back to the annex. But at this point, John C. had been unresponsive, so they decided to leave her by the door to Omicron. Richard suggested that everyone inside the site must have been dead. Later on, the team begins to lose oxygen, and instead of waiting out the inevitable, Strasky had pulled off his helmet, ending his life in the process. Emma also had died near the edge of the abyss from oxygen deprivation, where Richard seemed to be the last man standing. However, he is not seen again from this point. The ARC team at this time had still been residing inside Tau, where the remaining members had been full of regret, where they pleaded with Sarah to send the ARC to the stars. However, she refused, keeping the ARC at her side, where she comforted the rest of her team as they slowly starved to death. Eventually, Imogen had found her way to Site Upsilon, where she had the goal to defeat the WoW by targeting its weakness, power. Like all machines, the WoW would need electricity, so she decided to shut the power plant in Upsilon down. As the generators had shut down, however, so too did the ventilation system, causing Imogen to suffocate as the flow of oxygen was removed from the site. Fully believing her mission was a success, Imogen had accepted her fate and slowly but surely passed away. But sadly, this wasn't the end, as with the generators shut down, the WoW continued to run off the reserve power, allowing the WoW to continue its work it needed to complete, the preservation of humanity one way or another. Which brings us into the events of Soma. Over the next few months, there had been little to no activity in Pathos II aside from the robots, wildlife, and mutations roaming around the sites. However, back in Site Upsilon, on the 9th of May 2104, something had happened. The WoW had taken the brain scan of Simon Jarrett, taken from 2015, and placed his consciousness into the body of Imogen Reed, which from Simon II's perspective, he had his brain scan and had somehow ended up in the dystopian future, unknown to him of what really happened at this time.
What happened?
Hello? Mr. Munchie? Did something go wrong?
Upon his exploration of this new world, Simon had managed to restore some remnant power to this site, where he was contacted by a copy of Catherine's consciousness that was seemingly uploaded into a helper robot by the WoW, who told him to meet her in Site Lambda, which he did, but once he arrived, he heard a struggle nearby, where Catherine had been attacked by a flesher, but once he found Catherine, he is disappointed to find her as a helper robot rather than a human, where she reveals to him that he isn't quite human Catherine either, but she fills him in on what happened recently to her knowledge, since her memories come from the original scan Catherine had performed on herself, so she has no such memories of anything that transpired after that scan. With Simon's help, Catherine had discovered that the Ark hadn't been sent into space, and so the two decide to find the Ark and launch it into space at Site V, and to help Catherine, Simon had placed her Cortex chip into his Omni tool, so he could take her with him. After leaving Site Lambda, Simon had discovered an emergency vessel from the Curie, which he planned to take it to the Site Theta, only to find that it had been damaged beyond repair, and wasn't in a position to take him anywhere. This is where Simon had found the Curie, where he searched the ship for a suitable vessel to make the journey, all the while avoiding another flesher which seemed to distort reality around it, whenever Simon had looked at them, due to them messing with his circuitry, which Simon had found a suitable vessel, but once Simon had plugged Catherine into the computer, she saw that the safety locks had been holding the vessel in place, and only an emergency state would release them. So Catherine directs Simon to go down to the engine room so he can find a way to override the safety locks. Once Simon had gotten into the engine room, he had seen the WoW had been holding the ship together with a tentacle that fed into the reactor, which as soon as Simon had pulled the tentacle out, he had caused a chain reaction to occur within the reactor, destabilizing it, which caused the safety locks to release, which alerted a flesher to his position, which soon gave chase to him all the way back to the escape vessel.
Okay, I'm in.
So let's get the hell out of here.
It's taking so long.
We need to pump all the water out before we take off.
Can't you do it any faster?
I'm almost there. All right, here we go. Hold on to something.
Can you steer this thing?
Starboard rudder is choking, but I can compensate.
How do you even know what direction we're going in?
Don't worry, I'm hooked up to the navigator. We're headed for Theta. Should be a matter of minutes.
Thought I was done for back there.
Seems like the WoW is keeping the Curie from going into a catastrophic failure state. I mean, how did it get on the ship?
Are you talking about the black tentacles in the engine room? I've seen them before at Upsilon. What are they?
They're a manifestation of a malfunctioning station-wide artificial intelligence called the WoW.
Station-wide? So we just made a powerful enemy.
No, it's not like that. The AI isn't a persona. It doesn't feel or think like we do. It's more like a cancer.
Was that the ship?
Looks like your sabotage worked better than expected. Brace for impact! Hold on, the blast just pushed us off the plateau!
What does that mean?
If I don't hit Delta, we're dead.
Once the vessel had crashed, Simon had made his way into Site Delta, where he called a Zeppelin so they could travel to Theta, and once he had made his way into the site, he came across a Dunbat robot, which Catherine planned to use so they could reach Tau. But once it had been activated, the Dunbat had panicked due to containing the brain scan of another person, with it shouting out, "Catherine, this is all your fault," before being released and disappearing into the ocean, which forces Catherine and Simon to find an alternative path to Tau. There, Catherine and Simon had planned to head to Omicron and take the climber rig down into the abyss. However, upon his travels, Simon had encountered Terry, or what was left of him, where he had rendered Simon unconscious before wrapping him in mind coral, just like how he had done so to others in the past. But once Simon had come to, he managed to free himself before traversing the rest of Theta maintenance, all the while encountering several proxies who had once been Pathos II's employees, who, like Terry, had been mutated by the structure gel. Simon, however, managed to evade these monsters and eventually went through the sewers to get to Omicron, but once he arrived, he saw that the site was under quarantine, but he was soon sent a code on a terminal to release the lockdown. Unknowing to Simon, it was actually Ross who had sent him that code to release the quarantine lockdown, but Simon felt that something was off here, but Catherine wasn't fazed by it. Regardless, Simon headed into the site where they came across a dive room, where Catherine tells Simon that they need to transfer him into a new body so he could withstand the pressure of the abyss. But to do that, he first needed to find some items to repair the suit, and make it so he could transfer his consciousness into the suit, which he reluctantly agrees to do so. On his travels, however, he is met by several visions that derive from Ross, where he attempts to get Simon to stop the wow. Despite these visions, however, Simon presses onwards, where he gathers the necessary items for the suit, but is soon confronted by another mutated Pathos II employee, dubbed as the Robot Head, where it chased him all the way down to the suit station, which Catherine had slammed the door shut in on the monster. After adding the components to the suit, Simon sits in the pilot's seat, where a brain scan is initiated, and the new scan had been sent directly to the new suit. But then Simon hears himself talking, where Simon had misunderstood what just happened, where to his horror, Catherine explained that he is actually a copy of the Simon who sat in the pilot's seat. In a simpler term, the brain scan procedure is like copying a file and moving the copy to a new folder, where now there are two Simons. This is where Simon must make a choice, either to leave the old Simon in a stasis state until he eventually wakes up to find himself all alone, or to terminate the older version of himself. Either way, the new version of Simon and Catherine head down into the climber rig, where they ride it into the dark abyss. But as they descended down into the abyss, a power surge takes place, where Simon is confronted by Ross, where he is pleased by Simon's progress, where he tells Simon that he will prepare him for their arrival at Site Tau.
Hey, I know it's not much, but why have we stopped moving?
The power blacked out for a moment. Think it could be the atmospheric pressure. It's pushing pretty hard, really testing the limits of my suit.
Don't worry, it should hold.
Comforting.
It will hold.
Does time freeze when you're not powered?
Time feels omitted more than needed.
What's the difference?
I don't feel like I'm being held back or hindered. And I don't have the opportunity to reflect on the time I'm missing. It's simply missing.
Sounds like sleeping without the dreaming.
Yes. But generally you anticipate when you're about to sleep, and there's a natural continuation since we tend to wake up where we went to sleep. My experience is more like an ever-changing moment that never really seems to find closure.
Sounds kind of like a movie being edited live.
I suppose so. I guess it sounds exciting, but it really keeps me activated to the point of exhaustion.
It's rough.
Could be worse. Could be a time traveler stuck in a body made from black goo.
That'd be the worst.
As soon as he arrives in the abyss, Simon had encountered the corrupted and mutated wildlife, but he manages to evade them and made his way to Site Tau, where he finds a reanimated Jinn in a power suit who pursues Simon throughout the site, but he manages to escape it, where he enters the staff quarters, where he meets Sarah, who had been guarding the Ark and had been hooked up to a life support. Sarah, however, allows Simon to take the Ark from her, but asks for something in return. She asks Simon to deactivate her life support, where she would ask him to stay with her until she had passed away.
You serious about me killing you?
No, I'd love to hang around here until I dry up to the size of a raisin. Simon, this fucking sucks. I don't want to live like this.
Shouldn't we be doing something to keep you alive?
Why?
You're the last human. I just find it disrespectful to our entire history not to fight this. Sure, we have the Ark, but you're the real deal.
Thanks. That's probably the best compliment I've ever got. But the truth is that the Ark is all we have. We'll have to accept second best, you know?
None of this feels right.
Simon, I want to die.
Sarah.
Just think about it. Be careful. Would you stay with me, please? It won't be long now. Please, just stay. What a crazy thing this was. Life. At least I won't have to turn 30. Hooray! Wish I could have died at home with my friends. Have you ever been to Greenland? It's very beautiful. Well, at least when you get out of the city. Nanook is busy, and yes, there's like 12 million people trying to get around, but it's a great place. Or rather, it was a great place before the comet ended it all. You know what? I prefer it this way. I liked Pathos. Liked my colleagues. Ian, Nick, Jasper, even Catherine. People thought she was weird because she was quiet, but she was cool. Simon, you still there?
I'm here, Sarah.
Don't let him die, okay? Send them out there. To the stars.
Simon had taken the Ark to the cargo transport system so it could be taken to Site Phi, while he headed there by alternative means, which brought him to Site Alpha, where Ross explained to Simon that creating the WoW was a mistake, where he leads Simon to the center of Alpha that contained the WoW. Ross had pleaded his case to Simon, asking him to destroy the WoW with the uncalibrated structure gel, where Simon can either choose to ignore these pleas or go through with the destruction of the WoW. If Simon helps Ross, the WoW would rip his arm off and knock him unconscious, but if Simon had chose to leave the site without destroying the WoW, Ross would teleport him back. In either case, Ross attacked Simon, and if Simon refused to destroy the WoW, Ross would try to force him to do so, where he would be interrupted by the Leviathan that breaks through the floorboards, where it devours Ross. Once Simon had arrived at Site Phi, he had loaded the Ark into the shell, which is where he finds the dead body of Catherine. After this, Simon uses a pilot seat to load the shell into the Omega space gun, where Catherine scans herself and Simon, while also beginning the firing sequence. While the launch was successful, Simon had been confused as to why he was still in Site Phi, rather than being on the Ark, where Catherine once again has to explain the process that his consciousness and memories were copies, that the brain scan isn't a brain transplant. The stress of this confrontation, however, was enough to overload Catherine's cortex chip, causing it to break, where Simon is left alone in the darkness of the abyss, where he asks Catherine not to leave him alone.
10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6.
You gotta be kidding me!
5, 4, 3, 2.
Yes! Fuck yeah, we made it!
I'm still here. I'm still here. Catherine? Catherine?
I'm here.
What the hell happened? What went wrong?
Nothing. They're out there, among the stars. We're here.
No. We were getting on the Ark. I saw it. It finished loading just before it launched.
Yeah, I saw.
Then why are we still here?
Simon, I can't keep telling you how it works. You won't listen. You know why we're here. You were copied onto the Ark, you just didn't carry over. You lost the coin toss. We both did. Just like Simon at Omicron, just like the man who died in Toronto 100 years ago.
No, this is bullshit. We came all this way. We launched the Ark.
I know it sucks, but our copies are up there. Catherine and Simon are both safe on the Ark. Be happy for them.
Are you crazy? We're gonna die down here with those fuckers living at large on a spaceship. They're not us. They're not us.
I'm sorry you feel that way, Simon. I'm proud of what we did. We made sure that something of the hundreds of thousands of years of human history survived, that something lives on.
No. Fuck this. Fuck this. Fuck you. Fuck you, Catherine. You lied. And I believed in you. I trusted you. You said we're getting on the fucking Ark.
We are on the Ark, you idiot. I didn't lie. I can't be responsible for your goddamn ignorance. You
Fuck! Catherine? Please don't leave me alone. Catherine? Catherine?
The launch, on the other hand, had sent the shell containing the Ark outward into space, where the copies of Simon and Catherine had met face to face in what seems like paradise.
Whoa. Is this... Did it work? Catherine? Catherine! I can't believe we actually made it.
Well, we did.
I'm so relieved.
It's okay, Simon. Everything's all right now.
Thank you for watching the complete history and lore of Soma. If you enjoyed, then be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more lore, histories, and timeline related content, and why not hit the join button and become a member today for exclusive benefits such as early access to new videos, access to past livestream VODs, and to have your name present in all future videos. And I hope to see you back here real soon, and be sure to leave the video having a good one.